Yeah, so we're going to get started now. Thanks everyone so much. Thanks so much everyone for coming. We're really excited that you're all here and taking some time out of your day to learn all about the Northern Conservation Program that's been in development for almost a year and a half now. So we're really excited to tell you all about it today. And before we get started, I just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. So the Weston Family Foundation acknowledges that the land on which we operate today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So before we jump in, we're going to do a few housekeeping things. So first, I wanted to introduce you to the Northern Science and Research team who are on the call today. I am David Bysouth. I'm the program manager for the Northern Science and Research Committee. We also have Allison Ronson, who is the program director for the Northern Science and Research team. And we have Sarah Cook, who is the grant specialist for the team. And Allison will be joining me later to answer some of your questions. And speaking of questions, we are going to have a question period at the end of this webinar. So this is going to work by you putting your questions in the chat, and then we are welcoming all participants to submit questions during the webinar, and we'll read them out and answer them the best they can. And we're really looking for program-related kinds of questions or application-related questions. If you have project-specific queries about your specific conservation project, you can email them at northern@westonfoundation.ca, and we can dive in a little bit more in detail on your specific question on your project. So here's the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to go over the Weston Family Foundation and some objectives that we have. We're going to talk about the Northern Conservation Program as a broad overview. We're then going to go into the application process for the program. We're going to have our Q&A, and then we'll finish with some next steps. So the Weston Family Foundation is a private philanthropic foundation of the Weston family. And the Weston Family Foundation invests in innovation and learning in health and landscapes to deliver measurable impacts to the well-being of Canadians. And this looks like two different main pillars, healthy aging and healthy ecosystems. And both of those come together to focus on the well-being of Canadians. And what this has looked like is over 60 years of philanthropy with more than 3,500 grants awarded, over $600 million of total funds donated, and more than a $60 million annual giving target. So like I mentioned, there's the two main pillars of healthy aging and healthy ecosystems, but these are still pretty broad concepts. So the foundation has further subdivided each pillar into two committees per pillar. So on the healthy aging side, we have grants that focus on neuroscience and microbiome. And on the healthy ecosystem side, we have programs that focus on conservation and what we're here to represent today, which is Northern Science and Research. So the Northern Science and Research Committee was created in 2007 with a goal to significantly restore and protect biodiversity in Northern Canadian landscapes by funding research, protecting ecosystems, and connecting Canadians to nature. But what does that actually look like? So the Northern Science and Research team and committee has two main strategic corridors. The first is research and training, and the second is land use planning and policy. So historically, most of our programs and granting has fallen under that research and training strategic corridor. And we're hoping with this conservation program, we're going to move more into that land use planning and policy strategic corridor. So for the research and training strategic corridor, we're looking to build a better understanding of Northern ecosystems and supporting the next generation of Northern scientific leaders and conservation stewards. And for the land use planning and policy strategic corridor, we're looking to invest in organizations that engage in evidence-based advocacy to further the conservation of ecosystems and improve conservation policies. So what does this actually look like through some of the funding programs that we produced? So one of our flagship programs is the Weston Family Awards in Northern Research, and this is a student scholarship program that's been around for over 17 years and has supported more than 350 graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, with around $11 million invested in those students since 2007. And then earlier this year, we built on that program to launch the Northern Biodiversity Research Program, which some of you may be familiar with. And this was focused on conducting biodiversity-focused natural science research in Northern Canada that will be used by decision makers at decision-making tables. So both of these fall under that research and training kind of strategic corridor. And then we're hoping with this conservation program that we're going to expand on this by funding applied conservation work that will have a tangible impact on northern biodiversity. And we'll go into more of the specifics of that program shortly. So some important things to know about programs directed by the Northern Science and Research Committee. The first is that the application process is interactive. We really encourage applicants to connect with the foundation and discuss their letters of intent and their proposals. So you can email us and we can set up meetings and we can review some of the documents that you're putting together. And we're really happy to have that back and forth dialogue while you're putting your application together. And we really encourage it because we've seen that it strengthens a lot of the applications. So second is that funds are provided in tranches. So the funding is subject to successful completion of milestones set by the applicant and agreed on by the foundation. And we'll talk more about milestones when we talk about the application process, but there's typically multiple tranches of funding that will fall under your grant. And we're happy to discuss that more in detail if you reach out to us as well. And third is that the review process strengthens applications. So we have external reviewers, which we'll talk more about later as well. And their suggestions and feedback are used to strengthen proposals following the LOI selection. So for those of you that are able to move on to the proposal stage, the feedback you get from the reviewers will be really critical in developing and enhancing the success of your proposal. So that was a little bit about the foundation and the funding, and now we're going to talk about the Northern Conservation Program, which is why we're all here today. So the Northern Conservation Program aims to leverage the commitment made by the Government of Canada under the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity to set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So many of you may be familiar with the 30% by 2030 goal, and this is a goal to conserve 20 or 30% of Canada's land and waters by the year 2030. And we're hoping this political and societal will to do more conservation work can be kind of a starting point to move a lot of the important projects forward. So the Northern Conservation Program aims to support projects that will deliver tangible, realistic results for biodiversity conservation and demonstrate how ongoing stewardship of conserved lands will be accomplished. So unlike the Biodiversity Research Program, which was earlier this year, this program is going to focus on the actual applied conservation work. And the foundation recognizes that Indigenous communities are critical planners and stewards of northern ecosystems. And we encourage projects that are Indigenous-led or Indigenous-partnered. And the word here actually says encourage, but as we're going to talk about later, it's actually mandated that projects be Indigenous-led or Indigenous-partnered for this program. So the goal of this program is to provide funding to northern conservation projects that seek to protect and conserve or manage and steward areas of biodiversity significance. And we'll discuss both of those kind of funding streams in a moment. And this program supports a minimum of $450,000 to a maximum of 1.5 million Canadian dollars for projects spanning up to 3 years in length. But we're looking for projects aiming around the average grant size of $750,000. So we realize some projects may fall more in that $1.5 million range, but the more that is asked for by the grantee, the more competition you're inherently going to have based on the finite amount of dollars we have to give out for this program. So let's talk about those two different funding streams. The first is the protect and conserve stream. And this is where we're looking to see an increase in conserved northern land and ocean areas that are of high value for biodiversity or for resisting or adapting to climate change. And then for the manage and steward stream, we're looking for an increase in northern land and ocean areas that are governed and stewarded with ecologically and culturally sustainable policies and practices that support nature conservation and the protection of biodiversity. So the protect and conserve stream is really focused on establishing new protected areas or conserving those areas. And the manage and steward stream is really focused on exactly what it says, managing areas that are protected or are en route to being protected. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some examples of what each of those might look like. So for the protect and conserve stream of projects, some examples of the types of protected status that you could be seeking for your land could be things like an indigenous protected and conserved area or an IPCA, a marine protected area, something like a migratory bird sanctuary, or provincial, national, or territorial parks, or other measures of conservation. And we're going to really be flexible in the type of protection or conservation project that we're receiving from the applicants. And for the manage and steward stream, some examples of what these projects could look like could be guardians programs, community-based monitoring programs, establishing land or ocean management plans, or any other variety of projects that look to manage or steward land. So two caveats or points to consider for the manage and steward stream are the first is that we're going to be looking for some kind of financial sustainability plan, whether that be established at the beginning of the project or something that can be accomplished after the 3 years that the project is over. We want to make sure that the project can live beyond the lifespan of the grant, essentially, and that there's more management and stewardship that can happen after the 3 years of funding has succeeded. We also want these manage or steward projects to be in areas that are protected or conserved or are en route to being protected and conserved. So if you're putting forward a manage and steward project, it has to be in an area that has a designated protected or conserved status, or in the coming years is en route to achieving that kind of status. So the geographic scope for this program is the same for the biodiversity research program, if any of you saw that. So we are looking for landscapes, the boreal forest and northward, which is represented on this map. And this is defined by the shapefiles that are available on the Government of Canada website, as defined by Brandt et al. In 2009. And for the marine boundaries, we have 6 different marine bioregions that we're considering in the north for this program, which are the Arctic Basin, the Western Arctic, the Arctic Archipelago, the Eastern Arctic, the Hudson Bay Complex, and the Newfoundland Labrador shelves. And if you have questions about whether your project is in scope geographically, you can send us coordinates or the location of your project, and we're happy to verify that for you. So in addition to that boreal forest and northward in those marine bioregions, there's a few more criteria for where your project can take place. So first, it could be in an area of significantly high value for northern biodiversity, whether that be flora, fauna, or ecosystems. So these could be areas like habitat connectivity corridors, nesting or denning sites, areas important for wildlife, areas important for plants, anything where you can justify that it's a significant value for northern biodiversity. The second type of area can take place is high value for resisting or mitigating the impacts of climate change. So a really good example of this kind of landscape would be a peatland or a wetland, which are really significant for carbon storage and climate change mitigation. And then the third type of area would be an area providing options for wildlife and ecosystems to adapt to climate change. And the example of this could be like a climate refuge area. So your project can take place in one of these areas, in 2 of these areas, or in all 3 of these kinds of areas. And what's important is that the foundation welcomes and encourages applicants to present the best available combination of traditional knowledge and Western science to showcase the value of the proposed project for protecting and restoring biodiversity in Northern Canada. So we're looking for the location of the project to fall in one of those 3 categories, but the way you showcase why your location or project fits into one of those 3 categories can be based on Western science, it can be based on traditional knowledge, or the best available combination of both. And we're really hopeful and willing to accept a variety of different knowledge forms and how your area is protecting and restoring biodiversity. So in addition to all that, another important thing to consider when submitting your project is that it must be based on an existing demonstrable initial step in the conservation or stewardship process. So while we'd love to fund a bunch of startup conservation projects, for the sake of this program, we're looking for projects that have a bit of ongoing momentum already. So some examples of these initial steps could be things like feasibility studies, land or ocean management plans, signing of MOUs, community workshops, or stakeholder engagement sessions. But we're open to other examples of initial steps as well. We're really just looking, like I said, to see some momentum and some progress that's kind of already got the ball rolling on either these protect and conserve projects or the manage and steward projects. So we're going to summarize some big project must-haves now. The first, like I've mentioned, it has to be a protect or conserve project or a manage or steward project. And on the LOI, you're going to see a checkbox indicating where your project falls in one of those two categories. Next, it has to be based on an existing step in the conservation process. We just talked about some examples of those. But again, we really want to see some initial momentum in the conservation process for your project. Like I mentioned earlier, it has to be located in an area of high value for biodiversity, so specifically falling under one of those three criteria that I mentioned earlier. And again, we're open to diverse ways of showcasing why your project is of high value for biodiversity. We want to see that there's a capable team using appropriate methods, activities, and steps to achieve the outcome of the project. So this is especially going to be true in the proposal phase where we're going to look to understand the experience and knowledge of the team members who are carrying out the project. So the project has to be led by or partnered with an Indigenous community, organization, or agency, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. And finally, it has to fit within the funding criteria and geographic scope. So we've outlined some of the funding criteria, like the high value for biodiversity and the geographic scope, the boreal forest and northward, and those 6 marine bioregions. And again, if you have questions about the eligibility of your project, please feel free to reach out to our email, and we'll be happy to either discuss them with you or get back to you as soon as we can. So one of the big questions that we've been getting already for this program is this distinction between research and conservation. And the way I like to talk about this is by looking at it as a Venn diagram. On one side, you have research that's done to advance the state of knowledge and generate new information and really push fields of study forward. On the other side, you have conservation work that's kind of disconnected from the research process, where it's just trying to advance a conservation agenda forward. And in the middle, you have this kind of gray area where research can be informing conservation. So, for example, there could be conservation projects that need some kind of study or enhanced understanding in order to achieve the conservation outcomes. So, in terms of the Northern Conservation Program, this is kind of the spectrum that we're expecting projects to fall on. They can be either those conservation focused projects, or they can incorporate some form of research that is driving the conservation agenda forward. What we are not looking for this program are research focused projects where the entire project is focused on the research process and the research outcome. At most, we want the research to be a supporting piece of the application to drive those protection and conservation or management and stewardship goals forward. Again, if you have questions about that gray area or where your project might fall, feel free to reach out to us and we're happy to clarify as well. So that was an overview of the Northern Conservation Program. Now we're going to talk about the application process. So first, eligibility. This is going to be a repeat of some of the stuff we've talked about, but we really want to make sure we're hammering home some of the important applicant criteria. So first and probably most importantly is that the principal applicant has to be a qualified donee in accordance with the Canada Revenue Agency and Income Tax Act. And you can find out if you are a qualified donee on the CRA website. Second is that it has to be led by an Indigenous institution, agency, community, or organization, or an organization partnered with the Indigenous community or organization. And we will be looking for letters of support from the Indigenous organization or community for non-Indigenous partners. So third is that the project takes place in the identified geographic area. Once again, feel free to reach out if you have questions about if your project is within scope. As we've mentioned, the project has to be focused on protection and conservation or management and stewardship. And then finally, the project has to demonstrate that it uses the best available combination of Indigenous and scientific knowledge. So now we're going to talk about team members. So for this program, we're looking for one principal applicant per project. And once again, the principal applicant has to be a CRA qualified donee. So principal applicants can be supported by co-applicants or collaborators. So if there's non-qualified donees on the project, they can be listed as collaborators. If there's multiple qualified donees, you can list as co-applicants. So an applicant can only be the principal applicant for one project. So the individual who is the principal applicant for a project can only be the principal applicant for that one project. But they could be a collaborator or a co-applicant on a subsequent project. So organizations may submit one project in each program stream. So we mentioned we have protect and conserve stream, and we have the management and stewardship stream. So an organization could submit one application in each of those streams if they had distinct projects for each of those. Organizations with different chapters may also submit one application per chapter. So if an NGO or organization has a chapter in Ontario, in the Northwest Territories, in Manitoba, they could submit an application for each of those different chapters that span different geographies. And we are asking for groups working in the same geographies to consider consolidating applications. So if there's that there's a group of people or organizations all working on kind of a similar issue or topic in the same area, it would be probably stronger to try and bring all of that together in one more robust application than having each individual organization or community submit kind of piecemeal parts of that project. So in terms of the actual application process, it is a two-step process. The first is the letter of intent, which is due on November 26th of this year. And then the second part is the proposal, which is due on February 18th of 2025. So for the letter of intent, it's going to be roughly 3 pages of content focusing on the quality of the idea, eligibility, and scope of the project. And we'll discuss more about the LOI momentarily. And then for the proposal, it's going to be about 10 to 12 pages of content, plus any supplementary information. And the foundation is hopeful to provide applicants with proposal writing support if needed. So we're looking into options right now for those who are invited to the proposal stage, should they need it, to have writing and proposal writing or proposal support in order to put that together. And we want to really make sure that we're giving applicants the best possible chance to put forth the best application that isn't overly burdensome. So all of this is going to be reviewed and supported by an expert external review panel. And these external reviewers span multiple Indigenous communities, applied conservation backgrounds. We have half of our review panel as Indigenous and half coming from academic or conservation kind of backgrounds. And it's a really great group that is going to be able to do a great job in reviewing the LOIs and proposals. And both the letter of intent and proposal will be submitted by email to northern@westonfoundation.ca. So in terms of the actual review process for the letter of intent, we're really going to be focused on the fit of the conservation project. So looking at a bit of a higher level kind of evaluation of these applications, the first and foremost thing that we're going to be looking for is the fit for the program. Are you within scope? Are you eligible? Do you meet the criteria of the program? Next, we're going to be looking for the significance for biodiversity. Once again, you are able to present multiple forms of knowledge to showcase why your project is important for biodiversity. We're going to be looking for you to provide an adequate summary of your conservation project, whichever stream that project falls under. And then we're going to be looking for potential for impact. How likely is your project going to achieve an impactful conservation outcome in the time frame? And we're going to be looking for demonstrated community support. And this is going to be particularly important for NGOs or organizations who are not Indigenous, who are working with Indigenous communities or organizations. And then for the proposal phase, we're taking all of that information for the LOI and kind of moving it in a bit more detailed fashion. So we're going to be really focusing on the strength of the conservation project. So we're going to be looking for clear milestones and results for biodiversity. So we realize that both protection and conservation and management stewardship projects likely won't achieve the high level outcome in a 3-year time span. But there can be milestones and objectives that are achieved along the way in that 3-year span that move the project closer to that end goal. So we're going to be looking for clear milestones that can be tangibly hit in the 3-year time span of the project and looking at how those milestones have implications for biodiversity. We're really going to be focusing on the likelihood of success. So again, this is a 3-year program. So we want to make sure that each project has a robust team and resources and the capability to carry out the project so that there's a high likelihood of impact for northern biodiversity conservation. And to support that, we're going to be looking more at the team and the resources at this stage. So getting a bit more nuance on who is making up the team, what expertise are they bringing, what kinds of knowledge are they bringing to the table. We'll be looking for this in the proposal phase. Similar to the LOI, we'll be looking for alignment with the program. Are you meeting the criteria, the geographic scope, and also the protect and conserve or manage and stewardship goals? And then for the proposal, we'll be looking for a bit more of a robust budget and timeline for your project. So a bit more itemized and clear as to how the money will get spent. And we'll talk about expenses momentarily. So here's some common reason that LOIs are not invited to the proposal phase. The first and the kind of biggest reason is that the project is out of scope, whether that be it's out of geographic scope or not within the funding criteria. This is kind of the first thing we're going to look for LOIs not being moved to the proposal phase. The second is that the project is limited in its potential impact for northern biodiversity and our ecosystems. So we're really going to be looking for projects that have a likelihood of making a tangible, robust impact for northern conservation. Third is that there could be a lack of focus or cohesion in different elements of the grant. So some common mistakes are that applications can be too exploratory. There's not kind of a clear focus as to what the outcome may be. They could also be too ambitious for the time frame or budget. Again, we realize a lot of these projects may extend beyond the 3-year time span, but we're looking for clearly defined milestones that can be tangibly hit in that 3-year time span. So kind of a really important one for this program specifically is that the project is research focused rather than conservation focused. And this is going to be a really clear way for LOIs to not move to the proposal phase. So going back to that Venn diagram, I showed you kind of the spectrum of projects that we're looking to accept, purely conservation projects or ones that have a research component that feeds up into those top-down conservation goals. Projects that are focused solely on the research piece will not move forward to the proposal phase. So for the manage and stewardship projects, I mentioned earlier that we are looking for a financial sustainability plan for those projects in particular. So we would like to see in the LOI and proposal phase that there either is a financial sustainability plan or that there's a plan to make a plan for financial sustainability beyond the lifespan of this grant. And finally, the organization does not adequately outline the partnership that they have with an Indigenous organization, agency, or institution. And this particularly goes for non-Indigenous applicants. We really want to make sure that there's a robust partnership and co-design of this project that is facilitating the objectives of the community or Indigenous agency that you're partnering with. So some program funding information. This is an $8 million program budget, and we're looking to fund approximately 10 projects. But the number of awarded grants is contingent on the receipt of a sufficient number of high-quality applications. So funds will be granted only for direct costs that are justifiable for the work proposed, and project activities must be completed and funds used up over the 3-year time span. And like I mentioned earlier, the funding is milestone driven and tranche based. So grants are conditional on grantees meeting predefined milestones and providing deliverables. and those milestones will be built into the proposal phase of this program. So here's some examples, but not an exhaustive list of acceptable expenses for this program. So some could be salaries, consulting or third-party expertise, materials or travel expenses, workshops or event expenses, things like training, outreach, and communication, honoraria for community members or elders who are involved in the process, or things like acquiring permits or conducting environmental assessments. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are examples of direct expenses that are specifically applicable to this program. So I'm going to briefly touch on some quick frequently asked questions for the program. So can an applicant hold an additional grant for their project? The answer is yes, if the activities in this application are distinct. So if there's multiple streams of funding, we're looking for objectives that are specific to the funding that you're using from the foundation for your project. So can funding be used for overhead? And for this program, up to 10% of funding can be used for operational or institutional overhead fees. What expertise is on the review panel? Like I mentioned earlier, there's experts from varied geographic regions, indigenous communities, and applied conservation experience. So when will applicants be notified of their awards? And we're hoping to announce the recipients of the awards for this program in the spring of 2025, and an exact date will be made available closer to that time. And does the applicant need to be a CRA qualified donee? Yes, the principal applicant must be a qualified donee. Non-qualified donees can be collaborators on the project. So I'm going to briefly touch about some confidentiality. So interactions with the foundation are subjected to the foundation's standard non-disclosure agreement. So the foundation treats LOIs, proposals, research projects, and associated research information as confidential information. Participating scientific reviewers are subjected to the foundation's standard non-disclosure agreement. Confidential information will only be used by the foundation and its scientific review committee, and reasonable care is taken to protect confidential information from disclosure to third parties. So that was an overview of the application process. We're now going to move into the Q&A phase of this webinar. And my colleague, Allison Ronson, is going to join me to answer some of your questions. And again, feel free to put those questions in the chat and try to focus them more on the program or the application process. Again, if you have specific questions about your project, feel free to reach out to us at northern@westonfoundation.ca.
Thanks, David. So we do already have some questions that have come in through the chat. So Anne-Marie asks, is it possible that a project requesting 1.5 million be approved, but at a lower dollar amount? So for example, at 750,000.
This would be on a case-by-case basis. There is the possibility if you ask for any dollar amount that we could offer a lesser dollar amount if we feel like the objectives of that project can be carried out at a lesser dollar amount. We would leave that mostly to the discretion of our review committee. But we could also have a discussion specifically if that situation arose with the grantee as to the correct budget number that we're willing to provide.
From David, is a letter of support required at the LOI stage or application stage?
We're looking for letters of support at the proposal stage for this program.
Okay, Anne-Marie asks, what is the total dollar amount attached to this fund?
This is $8 million total for this program.
Yeah, over 3 years.
Over 3 years.
Yeah. And she also asked what proposal success rate are we targeting? And we are targeting about 50% proposal success rate. So if we're aiming to fund about 10 proposals, that means we're only going to be inviting about 20 proposals back to submit proposals. Okay, Benjamin has a question about a specific project related to mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows. Benjamin, I would suggest that you email us at northern@westonfoundation.ca to give us more information about your project. It does sound like a really great project, but it would have to fit into the criteria of the program, which is that it's managing or stewarding a protected or conserved area or a place that's on its way to being protected or conserved. Okay, so Daniel asks, you stated earlier that the program is only open to CRA registered donees. Would a for-profit company owned by a First Nation be eligible to apply? Do you know the answer to this
Go
one?
ahead.
Okay, so the answer to that one is you would have to be registered with the CRA as a qualified donee. And so you can check that by going to the CRA's website to their list of qualified donees to see if you're registered. Often a First Nation will be registered as a qualified donee that is equivalent to a municipality or another body that's like fulfilling the role of government. For-profit companies are often not registered as qualified donees.
Also, another thing to add to that question is if you are not a qualified donee, you can still feel free to send us an email. And if we know of a qualified donee doing similar work in your area, we could try to match you with that organization as a principal applicant, but that would have to be on a case-by-case basis. And we can't guarantee that that match would happen, but we can try to support that process.
Yeah. Okay. Jason asks, can an applicant hold an additional grant for their project? Could this mean multiple grants? For example, if a project requires 4 million and currently has 3 other grants, could an application to the Weston Family Foundation help close the gap if it supports specific activities?
Yeah, like we mentioned earlier, we're more than happy for projects to have multiple streams of funding as long as it's very clear how the funding for that we are providing is uniquely contributing to the project. So we'd want to see some unique objectives or deliverables that are directly associated with the funding that you're receiving from the Weston Family Foundation.
Jenny asks, can an organization submit more than one application?
Yeah, so organizations are welcome to submit more than one as long as each one is falling under a different program stream. So you could have one that falls under that protect and conserve stream and one that falls under that management and stewardship stream as long as they're distinct projects. Also, if an organization has multiple chapters that span different geographies, you're welcome to submit an application per chapter or per geography in that case.
So Clara does point out that not many Indigenous governments are inherently CRA qualified donees. Is there any way for an Indigenous government that does not have this status to lead a project without partnering with an outside organization? Unfortunately, at this time, the foundation is only able to fund qualified donees. And so that Indigenous community or government would have to partner with a qualified donee in order to be eligible to receive funding. But as David stated already, we're happy to try to partner communities with organizations they could work with, although we can't guarantee that that partnership would come to fruition. Okay. As an NGO, Nicholas asks, as an NGO applicant that partners with several Indigenous communities, can a proposal include several Indigenous communities and nations that are not necessarily working together, but would be doing similar conservation work?
I think in that situation, we would definitely require letters of support from the different communities that you're working with, even if they're not all directly working together. But we'd like to see how. I think it would be best if you emailed us at northern@westonfoundation.ca so we could get a little bit more information about that project. I don't want to give an answer here that may not reflect the actual circumstance that you're describing. So if you email us specifics of that question, I think we'd be better equipped to answer it there.
Okay, Jennifer asks, is matching funding required? If so, is there a match ratio and is in-kind match eligible?
Matching funding is not required. It's welcomed, but it's definitely not required for this program.
Okay. Daniel asks if projects must be linked to a specific conserved/protected area. How does this apply to First Nation territory that is not an IPCA? So there are, I think, many ways that an area can be protected or conserved. And if a First Nation, for example, might have a declaration from chief and council, for example, that they're undertaking a land use plan that involves designating certain parts of their traditional territory as conserved areas, but they're not necessarily declaring that an IPCA. So we will accept on a case by case basis evidence of protection or conserved status as long as that can be sort of demonstrated and proven.
And again, the actual designation of protection conservation doesn't necessarily have to happen in the 3-year time span of this project. We're just looking for either milestones en route to that or kind of evidence that the project is moving in that direction for the management and stewardship projects.
Would a project embedded, from Jean-Philippe, would a project embedded in an ongoing attempt to create an IPCA be eligible even though the territory is not currently protected? Yes.
I don't see why not. That seems like a perfect fit for the protect and conserve stream of this program. If you have more specific questions about that project, you can again feel free to email us.
Yeah, so the project would be to achieve that protected IPCA status. I don't know how else to.
Yeah, we would be happy to provide
Yeah.
the funding for the activities or steps that are necessary to move that project towards IPCA status.
Yeah.
But again, if you have more like nuanced questions about that project, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah. Would funding be contingent on success? For example, if the project is focused on seeking an IPCA, but is unsuccessful in establishing the IPCA due to government/industry pushback, will the project not be funded?
No, that's not the case. Again, we're looking for milestone-based tranche delivery of the funds. So you're going to have several milestones that lead up to the end goal of creating that IPCA. So as long as we see like progress towards those milestones, I think that's really what we're looking for here. We understand there's a lot of roadblocks and things that can happen en route to protected area conservation. So yeah, and again, we can address that on kind of a case by case basis, but not achieving your protected status does not mean that the funding will not be delivered.
Yeah. And when we'll work with grantees, if the political situations change, we will work with grantees to figure out how does that affect your project. Okay, I see that Lawrence has his hand up. Lawrence, I've allowed your mic, so if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question. Okay. Okay, well, or, happy to keep taking questions in the chat. I will point out that all of this information that David went through is available on our website in a document called the program details that you can click on and download. And it's an exhaustive document that goes through all of this.
We're also going to be posting the webinar on our website in the coming weeks. So if you need to review any of this information, you can also find it there.
Are there examples of projects you guys have funded in the past? This is a brand new funding stream for the Weston Family Foundation. So I'm afraid I actually can't provide any examples of projects that we have funded in the past that are applied hands-on, on the ground protection or conservation or management or stewardship projects. But there are lots of examples in the world of these projects. So, I'm thinking of when the Litsel Dene First Nation in the Northwest Territories, worked for years to create the Dene Nene National and Tribal and Territorial Park. It's IPCAs that have guardians programs that are managing and stewarding those IPCAs. That's kind of what we're looking for.
If there's any last questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
Lawrence still has his hand up. I have enabled the microphone.
His hands down.
Oh, hand down. Okay. Maybe we answered your question already, Lawrence.
But also feel free to reach out by email if we did not answer your question.
Something. Oh, how does pressure from industry influence your decision? Is protecting valuable habitat that is under imminent threat considered?
Yeah, again, we would definitely like to see more information about your project specifically, but we're definitely open to protection from any kind of disturbance, whether whatever anthropogenic kind of disturbance is kind of threatening that habitat. But if you have very specific questions about the industry or the project or the habitat that you're dealing with, feel free to reach out. We're happy to schedule a chat or answer your question by email.
Oh, what is the expected response timeline for LOIs?
We are hopeful to get back to applicants on LOIs early in 2025, I believe. Kind of the first or second week of January, I think, is our goal right now.
Yeah.
Giving our reviewers some breathing room to actually review all the LOIs that come in over the holidays.
And that timeline might change if we have an overwhelming number of LOIs that are eligible and that go to our reviewers. It's possible that this program, that the proposal phase wouldn't be due at the end of February, but later on in the year.
But we'll have to see what the application process looks like for the LOIs.
What is the recommended project start date? So projects must start in 2025, and they can span 3 years, but they don't need to be calendar year 25, 26, 27. They can start, say, in 2025 and go by fiscal year. So 25, 26, 26, 27, 27, 28. The last sort of amount of funding we have for this program ends in the first quarter of 2028 for us. So January, February, March of 2028.
So I guess with that being said as well, we wouldn't want to see like the biggest allocation of your funding go in 2028 either. We'd kind of like to see it kind of tapering down at that point as well. Any last minute questions?
Okay, Amos looks like he has a question. Let me just allow your mic. Okay, Amos, if you'd like to take yourself off mute.
Thank you. Sorry, my chat isn't working.
Okay.
I was just wondering, so if we're not applying this year, can we expect there to run the program in following years?
We have one intake for this current 3-year program.
Yeah.
We will hopefully have another iteration of some kind, but the intake won't happen likely until 2027.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
Okay, Charity has a question. I'm just going to allow your mic, Charity. Go ahead. Charity, if you want to unmute yourself.
I'm trying. Thank you.
There you go. Oh, you're muted again. We had you for a second. Oh, okay.
Okay,
ahead.
all right, thank you. Like Amos, for some reason, my chat function is not working, so I'm following his example and just offering my question. Thank you both for this. It's been very informative. Just a question about the FAQ slide. The very first box that David showed, the question was, can an applicant hold an additional grant for their project? And I'm afraid I don't really fully understand that question or your explanation. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, could you just give an example of what you mean by that? And I think that would help us to understand.
Yeah, so like I said, we're really open to additional funding being used, but in the application that's being put forward, we'd like to see that in the grand scheme of the whole project, that there's kind of distinct milestones or objectives that are linked to the funding that is coming from this project or from this funding specifically. They can feed into kind of the broader objectives of the project as a whole, but we'd like to be able to kind of attach some impact from distinct milestones that are linked to the funding that is being provided by this grant. Do you have an example that you could add?
Yeah, so Charity, like you might have a project where the Weston Family Foundation is providing money, but also another granting foundation. And we just want to see that the activities, I suppose, are distinct. So they might both be supporting the same project, but the Weston Family Foundation's supporting this tranche of activities, whereas the other grants are funding like this work over here.
Okay, thank you so much. That's very helpful. I understand now.
I know sometimes it's hard to separate out project activities.
And again, if you want to discuss that in a bit more detail, feel free to reach out to us, or how your bigger project fits into the budgeting of several different grants. We'd be happy to discuss that as well.
Great, thank you.
Questions?
I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I don't see anyone else with their hand up. Thanks to everyone who have written their thanks in the chat. It's very nice of all of you.
Okay. If there's no more questions, I'm going to move on just to briefly touch on some next steps. So to submit an LOI, you can visit www.westonfoundation.ca/Northern Science and Research. And then you can navigate to the Northern Conservation Program page and fill out the LOI template and email that to us at northern@westonfoundation.ca. And again, the due date for the LOIs is November 26th of this year at 3 p.m. Eastern. So some important dates. All of you know about the October 16th important date since you're all here. We also have another webinar next Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024, from 2:30 to 3:30. So if you'd like to sit through me presenting this all over again, feel free, but it will be the same information presented. Again, the letter of intent deadline is November 26th at 3 p.m. The full proposal deadline currently is February 18th, 2025 at 3 p.m. Eastern. And the anticipated award notice is spring of 2025 with an exact date coming closer to that time. And with that, I'd just like to say a big thank you for everyone for being here today. We really appreciate all of your interest and your questions and your support as we've been putting this program together and now launching it. And we're really excited to see some of the amazing projects that get put forward and read through all the amazing work that's being done. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at northern@westonfoundation.ca. We really encourage that, and we're happy to chat with you about your project. And you can apply on our website at www.westonfoundation.ca. So again, thank you all for coming, and I'm sure we'll be in touch with a lot of you in the coming weeks. Thank you.